Hello. Be most welcome to the session on the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, Structuring a New Alliance of Democracies. So the conference title. I am truly honored that our conference begins with such a distinguished panel of experts, and I am delighted to personally welcome our chair, Dr. Mark Plattner, and our panelists, Dr. Karl Gershman, Dr. José Manuel Barroso, Dr. Wilhelm Hofmeister, and Dr. Amikai Megan. It is now my pleasure to introduce our chair, Dr. Plattner, who is very well known to many of you. Dr. Plattner is founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and is now the journal's co-editor emeritus, as well as distinguished non-resident fellow at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. He is now a member of NED's board of directors. He is the author of Democracy Without Borders, Global Challenges to Liberal Democracy. His essays on a wide range of international and public policy issues have appeared in numerous books and journals. Over the past 3 decades, he has co-edited with Larry Diamond more than 24 books on contemporary issues relating to democracy in the Journal of Democracy book series. Dr. Plattner is the chairman of our Institute's International Advisory Board, and he is the key international partner of the Estoril Political Forum. He has been an active participant in the conference since 1998. We are honored to have him with us today. Dr. Plattner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rita, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's a real privilege for me to chair this session of our conference, which bears the same title as the conference as a whole. On the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, Structuring a New Alliance of Democracies. Let me begin by saying a bit about this topic and how it came to be chosen. Professor Espada, as many of you probably know, is both a great enthusiast for commemorating worthy events and a devoted admirer of Winston Churchill. So it's not surprising that he came up with the idea of commemorating the Atlantic Charter in connection with this year's Estoril Political Forum. It was I who then suggested a subtitle that focuses on alliances among democracies, as this was a subject that had been raised by Joe Biden's presidential campaign, and therefore was a topic of extensive discussion in Washington. At the beginning of this year, the Institute for Political Studies began publicizing its 2021 conference along with this title. And to our great surprise, the title that we had chosen seemed to have made an impact on the world of high politics. In June, during the G7 summit in Cornwall, as Professor Espada mentioned, Boris Johnson met with Joe Biden, and they issued a document labeled the New Atlantic Charter, specifically reaffirming the, quote, commitments and aspirations, close quote, endorsed by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill in August of 1941, during some of the darkest days of the Second World War. The initial article of this new 2021 statement declared, quote, First, we resolve to defend the principles, values, and institutions of democracy and open societies, which drive our own national strength and our alliances. Now, the notion that democracies should increase their cooperation in defending democratic principles has generally received quite a favorable response. But figuring out what form such cooperation should take, how it should be structured, remains a much more difficult and more controversial issue. For there's an inevitable tension between the desire to make democratic alliances as inclusive as possible and the desire to ensure that their member states adhere to democratic principles. This becomes especially acute in cases of so-called democratic backsliding, which raise the question of whether countries with dubious democratic credentials should be allowed to retain their membership in democratic clubs. The dispute between the EU on the one hand and Hungary and Poland on the other revolves around this issue, as do various arguments about whether India should be welcomed into new democratic structures in the Indo-Pacific. This is the kind of question that will continue to plague efforts to organize democracies internationally. The democratic summits that President Biden is planning to convene in the near future, I believe the first one is now scheduled for December 9 and 10 as a virtual meeting. In any case, these summits will have to address the thorny question of which country should and should not be invited to participate. As far as I'm aware, the Biden administration hasn't yet made the hard decisions on this question. In any case, I suspect that several of our speakers this afternoon will confront some of these tensions. We have a superb group of panelists. First, we will hear by Zoom from Israeli political scientist Amichai Magen. He'll be followed by an American, Carl Gershman, who, as Professor Oshpada told you, recently retired as the founding president of the National Endowment for Democracy, and who will be speaking about the endowment at the George Washington Memorial Dinner tomorrow evening. And the concluding speakers will be two distinguished Europeans, Jose Manuel Durão Barroso, former president of the European Commission, and Wilhelm Hofmeister of the Adenauer Stiftung, who I just learned is the author of a newly published book called Political Parties in Democracy, now out in Spanish, but will be appearing in several other languages. But let me begin then by calling on Amichai Magen, who will be speaking to us by Zoom. Amichai, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Jose Manuel Barroso, Rita Brito, Carl Gershman, Wilhelm Hofmeister, Antonio Montero, Mark Plattner, and of course, my dear friend, João Carlos Oshpada. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is a tremendous honor and a pleasure for me to join you this afternoon at the Estoril Political Forum. My only regret is that I am able to join you online only rather than physically in beautiful Estoril. Let us pray that this is the very last year of COVID restrictions and that we shall be able to return to meet in person as human beings should meet, starting from the next Estoril Political Forum in 2022 and forevermore. Let me also take this opportunity to express my deepest admiration and thanks to a man who is an inspiration to all of us, to Carl Gershman, founding president of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, who retired in July this year after 37 years at the pinnacle of service to the cause of human liberty and well-being. I first met Carl as a 26-year-old doctoral student at Stanford, and it would be no exaggeration to say that that meeting has shaped and steered my professional life ever since. In expressing my admiration and thanks to Karl, I would like to quote from a brand new essay in the Journal of Democracy written by Mark Plattner in tribute to Karl's extraordinary career. And let me quote, "Karl became a commanding figure within the global democracy community, widely admired for his remarkable energy and his unflagging devotion to the cause of democracy. I do not believe Karl ever sought another position. He held the job that he most wanted in the world. It is hard to imagine a happier fit between a leader and the organization he led than that between Karl and the National Endowment for Democracy." Karl, thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this year marks the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, which in hindsight of 8 decades proved to be the cornerstone of the post-Second World War global order. Issued in the darkest days of the war and the Holocaust, the statement made jointly by America and Great Britain on the 14th of August 1941 articulated a vision for peace, for a free, peaceful, and prosperous world. The world that would rise after 1945 from the ashes of tyranny, carnage, and devastation. With your permission, I would like to put before you 3 thoughts about the legacy of the Atlantic Charter, as well as how it might help us think about the structuring of a new alliance of democracies for the 21st century. Firstly, the August 1941 Atlantic Charter was an act of extraordinary political imagination and boldness. It was made at a time when it was far from certain that America and Britain would win the war, or that human liberty itself would survive in the face of the mighty forces of Nazism, fascism, and communism. In 1941, after all, there were barely 10 democracies on the face of the planet. Yet, in the midst of darkness, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt saw light and spoke light with clarity and conviction. Indeed, within the Charter were contained all of the essential elements of Pax Americana and post-World War world order. Out of the Atlantic Charter came the values that would give us the 1942 Declaration by United Nations, which became the basis for the United Nations Charter and the United Nations Organization. Out of the Atlantic Charter came the principles of self-government for all and freedom from fear and poverty. Out of the Atlantic Charter came the ideas that would become the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the Bretton Woods institutions. Out of the Atlantic Charter came the ideas that would give birth to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And out of the Atlantic Charter came the ideas that would give birth to the process of European integration. And this year, 2021, we also mark the 70th anniversary of the Treaty of Paris that created the European Coal and Steel Community, the first formal step towards European integration. In seeking a new alliance of democracies for the 21st century, we can draw tremendous inspiration from the Atlantic Charter, its moral clarity, its courage, its boldness, and its ambition. The main lesson left to us by the architects of the Atlantic Charter is essentially one of what I would describe anchored adaptation. Maintain the fundamental values of human freedom and responsibility, stand by them and defend them vigorously, but do not be afraid to articulate and to pursue bold new ideas, institutions, and processes for how those values are to be exercised in a new and uncertain world. Be anchored to your core values, but do not be shackled by outdated modes of ordering the world. That, to me, is the primary lesson contained in the Atlantic Charter. Second, the legacy of the Atlantic Charter should remind us of the centrality of transatlanticism to the fate of the free world as a whole. Our 21st century adversaries would like to see America falter, the European Union fragment, and for America and Europe to drift apart from one another. This is true of China and Russia, of Iran, North Korea, and the various branches of radical Islam. They are each, in their own way, interested in the faltering and fragmentation of the transatlantic community. We must realize this, and we must put aside fights within the family, the transatlantic family, and we must do everything we can to reinvigorate and renew a world order in which America and Europe are united by shared values and robust institutions. Earlier this year, a new Atlantic Charter was signed by President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as Mark Plattner already commented, in their first meeting in Cornwall. We need more thinking and more action precisely in this direction. But in the 21st century, we need to reach outwards and build outwards to additional partners in a new community of democracies. Specifically, we have both an urgent need and an opportunity to develop a more global community of what I would describe, and others have described, as high-tech democracies. Countries that would include not only the United States and the European Union and Britain, but also Australia, Canada, India, Israel, Japan, South Korea, and crucially, Taiwan. Which brings me to my third and final point, ladies and gentlemen. Structuring a new alliance of democracies for the 21st century must be guided by a clear-sighted understanding of what we have achieved together in the past 80 years, what we risk losing, and what we stand to gain for the whole of humanity in the years and decades to come. Our mission fundamentally is to recommit ourselves to the core values of human freedom and flourishing. And we know what they are. And at the same time, to launch another era of political imagination and innovation. We must make democracy deliver again, and to do it better than our authoritarian competitors. And in doing so, we can take great courage and inspiration from the 1941 Atlantic Charter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amichai, for a very forceful and clear presentation. And next we will hear from Carl Gershman.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Amichai, for that really wonderful tribute. I remember well when we were together at Stanford. It was probably 20 years ago. And I knew then that you had a great promise, and you certainly have fulfilled that promise so far, although you still have great things to do, I know. And I want to congratulate João. You know, this is the biggest meeting that I've been in or seen during COVID, and also bigger than any previous meeting of the Estoril Political Forum. And it's just a tremendous tribute to João, who has built this conference and built this institution and is doing so much to educate young people in Portugal. It's a tremendous accomplishment, so congratulations to you, João. I'm just back. I returned to the United States on Wednesday and now I'm back in Europe. where I was in Prague and attended a meeting of Forum 2000, which was established by Václav Havel and Elie Wiesel 25 years ago. And everybody was happy in Prague. You've probably read about their election, where the voters basically ousted a kind of oligarchic, populist Prime Minister, Babiš, and elected, this is the first time since the end of the Cold War that there will not be communists in the government. They didn't get the threshold 5%. But real, Democrats are going to come in right now, and it's a big change. And it also conceivably could augur well for the elections that are coming up this spring in Hungary. We don't know. It's very close there. But those are very, very important elections. And so there was a lot of happiness in Prague, is what I'm saying. But it's one of the few places in the world today where people are happy about democracy. Democracy is in trouble, as we all know. This is a long-standing problem. Freedom House has charted 15 consecutive years of decline of civil and political liberties in the world, starting in 2006. And the transatlantic alliance itself is in trouble, and we have to confront that. You're going to be hearing from Bill Golston right after this panel, and Bill and I together worked on a resolution for a group that met at the Forum 2000 conference, which is called the International Coalition for Democratic Renewal, and João heads the transatlantic working group of this international coalition. And so the international coalition, on the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, adopted a resolution on the alliance. And it opened with discussing the problems of the alliance, the fact that it is falling into disarray. And what was mentioned probably most seriously is the increasing trend toward U.S. unilateralism. And the resolution stated that this has been a problem of 4 consecutive U.S. presidencies, starting with Bush, then Obama, who turned away from Europe more toward Asia, Trump, and even Biden today, where the foreign policy for a middle class, according to a lot of specialists who are writing about these things in the United States, has a large element of America Firstism to it. And we saw that in the way we disengaged from Afghanistan without adequate consultation with our European allies. There was consultation, but it was not really done. Even though there were more non-US troops in Afghanistan at the time when Biden announced the withdrawal in April, than there were US troops, and the US really didn't have a combat role there. Still, it was done without consulting with the countries that did have, adequately with the countries that did have troops there. And then you had the Australia, UK, US security partnership, which was another issue of tension between the countries. And then you have the problem of issues over burden sharing in paying for the NATO alliance, which has been a problem, conflicts over trade, and then, the issue that Germany and France are establishing relations with Russia and China, which don't, in the view of many, don't take adequately into account the security and human rights threats that are posed by these countries. Mostly it's done for economic reasons. And recently there was a poll conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations about European attitudes toward these issues. And there was a very distinct reluctance on the part of the European populations to recognize the distinction, that the distinction between democracies and autocracies is something that's fundamental, that it structures the world. Even there's a significant plurality of Europeans who don't really, according to this poll, who don't really believe that regime type makes a difference. And in terms of attitudes on China, while a lot of people will, 2/3 of people in Europe feel that there is emerging a new Cold War with China, but it's between the United States and China, and it really doesn't have to do with Europe. Europe's concerns have much more to do with, to the degree that their security concerns have much more to do with Russia, which is closer by. And it's, you know, China, one has to think very seriously about whether or not China affects Europe. Is this something that Europeans need to take seriously? Because it is far away. Does Hong Kong matter? Does the genocide against the Uyghurs matter? And there's what His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said, there is a cultural genocide taking place against the Tibetans as well. The Belt and Road Initiative is an initiative to really strengthen China's strategic power with the countries in the global south. The security concerns in the South China Sea, the buildup of forces on the border between India and China in the Himalayas is extremely dangerous. And India has become a very strong advocate of the Quad and security relations in dealing with China. The rise of a surveillance state in China, with using all these technologies to monitor people. Does this have any significance to us? The effort to try to undermine global norms within the UN system and within the global system, does all this matter? President Tsai of Taiwan has an important article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, in which she said that were Taiwan to fall, it would be a catastrophe, not just for the regional peace and security, but also the global alliance system. Is that true? If Taiwan were to fall, and we've just seen all of these threats, military threats that are being made against Taiwan, does it matter? Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel laureate who died in prison, and he said in 2006 about China's rise economically, that if China continued to rise as a dictatorship, this is Liu Xiaobo talking, he felt that this would pose a threat to liberal democracy throughout the world. But this is so far not seen sufficiently in Europe. But I really think people should think very seriously. Everyone here is wearing masks. Why are you wearing masks? You're wearing masks because of COVID. Where does COVID come from? And how did it happen that this disease became a pandemic? There is growing evidence, a recent very powerful, long editorial in the Washington Post just last week, but growing evidence that it did come from a lab leak in Wuhan. But when Australia even raised the issue that this should be investigated, they were punished by China. This has been a great cover-up. There's a woman by the name of Zhang Zhan, 37-year-old woman, who went to Wuhan in February of 2020 as a journalist. She's also a lawyer. So that she wanted to report to the Chinese public about this emerging epidemic, and then which became a pandemic. She was arrested, sentenced to 4 years in prison, and she's now on a hunger strike, near death in China. Do we know about this woman? Does anybody even care about this woman? If this were happening in the United States, where the United States were covering up something which was devastating, 5 million deaths to the health of the world, and we're all wearing masks, I'm not, but I'm speaking. This has an effect. We don't know all you can't find all the evidence because a lot of it has been destroyed, but the State Department sent a team to this laboratory in 2018, before the pandemic, and they reported that these conditions were unsafe. And in the Washington Post editorial last week, they reported that they were doing many, many gain-of-function experiments in this lab, which was being done under unsafe conditions. The idea that it has nothing to do with what happened, with the lab in Wuhan is in my view, not realistic. But the UN, the World Health Organization, when they went to China, they were forced, if there was going to be a statement, to say that it was extremely unlikely that it could have happened in that way. My point is that even though Russia is closer, Europeans have to consider very, very carefully what we're dealing with in a country like China as we think about how we can broaden the alliance structure, whether Europeans have any stake in Taiwan's future, in the security of Asia. And finally, the elephant in the room that we dare not talk about is the future of the United States, something that I happen to be very, very worried about. I'm going to maybe just refer to some journalists because I really don't want to comment politically, but there is grave, grave concern that there has been a weakening since the summer politically of the Biden administration, Afghanistan, the debates that are now being held over this infrastructure bill, crime, immigration, inflation, all these problems, which are leading a lot of people to the conclusion that it is not out of the question that we could have a return of the previous administration. And what that would mean, both for our country and its security, and for the alliance structure. So in my conclusions as to what all of this means, I think, that we cannot take the alliance, the NATO alliance, for granted. And we cannot take the United States for granted, the United States leadership for granted. The United States is a deeply, deeply polarized country today, dangerously polarized country today, to the point where it's not only very difficult to get anything done, but you have almost a division into two countries. It's very, very dangerous for a country that is supposed to be the leader of the free world. And so we have to think very seriously about this. And what this means is that other countries, mid-level powers like Germany and France, are going to have to step up and help fill the vacuum. And smaller countries like, I was in the Czech Republic, and they understand that they have to play a larger role. And Lithuania, has decided to break from the 17+1, China's relations with Central European countries, and to invite Taiwan to open an office in Vilnius. And they are being threatened and punished, just as the Czechs are threatened and punished. The mayor of Prague has the Tibet flag flying from City Hall. And there's a strong Tibet caucus in the Czech parliament. The voice of Europe needs to be heard, and needs to be heard more vigorously. And I just want to say that I was very taken with the speech that I heard on the screen from the President of Portugal, President Rebelo de Sousa. Am I saying it correctly? But he used the term the free world. I thought that was extremely important. And, nobody talks in those terms anymore, as if there is no conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, democracy and dictatorship in the world today. Bill will talk more about, I'm sure, about the recommendations that were made in that resolution that was passed in Prague. But the resolution called upon the alliance to squarely come to terms with these conflicts within the alliance. It endorsed strongly free trade, which this is not something that the United States will endorse today. to counter the internal problems in different countries, and then also to recognize that there is a conflict in the world today between authoritarianism and democracy. Even though it's not like the Cold War, there is a conflict over values, over norms. And the resolution said that don't look for a third way, don't look for a neutral position. It's not there. You've got to recognize what this is. Even if it's not the same as the Cold War, and we live in a much more conflictive but also unstructured world. Finally, I think in this new period, the voice of civil society is going to become more important than ever before. I've said before, and I'll say it again here, that the activists on the front line and members of parliament and others, voices, Joao and others who are here, are going to have to lead from the front. Lead from the front. That's taking a phrase from Obama, who said the U.S. should lead from behind. Civil society, advocates and intellectuals are going to have to lead from the front. The way the president of the Czech Senate, when I was there and met him, he's somebody who visited Taiwan last summer, and when he was there, he mentioned, he echoed John F. Kennedy when he went to Berlin, Ich bin ein Berliner, and he said in Mandarin, I am a Taiwanese, which I thought was quite remarkable. And Havel, of course, was a model in the way he showed solidarity with people like the Dalai Lama, who was the first international visitor to Prague for Aung San Suu Kyi when she was in prison, for Osvaldo Paya, the great Cuban activist who was murdered by the Cuban regime in 2012, and also for Liu Xiaobo. And the last, I mentioned this when I was speaking in Prague, Havel's last act was to send a letter to 8 political prisoners in Belarus, telling him that he would do everything he could 3 days before his death. But he said he had friends who were going to carry this on, who would bring their cause to the international attention. And 4 of those prisoners are once again in prison in Belarus today. So all of these struggles are important, and the voices of civil society and advocates have to be heard from. As a last point, I just want to say I took a walk down by the water before this session, and when I was coming back, I don't know if you've been to the park, right? It's really right there. About 100 yards away, there's a bench sculpture of 3 great Polish heroes from World War II. Jan Karski, Jerzy Lerski, and then somebody that I worked very closely with at the NED, who was really my advisor on Poland, Jan Nowak. He's one of the 3 on that bench, and it was a thrill for me to see Jan. He died in 2005, who was a great, great, great Polish hero. And those 3 people should be an inspiration to us. You know, I hope that the world is not coming to what they lived through in World War II and the Holocaust and all those horrible things. But we can't take for granted freedom and liberty. There was an American abolitionist, Wendell Phillips, who said, you know, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And we have to, and the Western Alliance is in trouble today. And it's going to take all of our efforts, not just the efforts of a few leaders. It's going to take all of our efforts to strengthen and rebuild it. Thank you.
Many thanks, Carl, for those eloquent but sobering words. And next we'll hear from Dr. Barroso.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much to the Instituto de Estudos Políticos and my good friend, Professor João Carlos Espada, for this invitation. Let me also say how honored I am to be in this panel with Karl Gershman, William Hofmeister, and also Amichai Megan, and besides, of course, director of our Studio Political Forum, Rita Seabra Brito. To all of you, my thanks for your participation and for your invitation to be with you this afternoon. So the subject that was proposed for discussion was structuring a new alliance of democracies. The question is, for me, how? Alliance of democracies, as we can understand, and I'm sure you certainly expect me to say so, I'm in favor. I'm in favor because I am Portuguese, because I'm Democrat, because I remember when my country was not a democracy. I was 18 years old when there was the end of an authoritarian regime without freedom of expression, without freedom of press, without political parties, still with colonialism. I remember well, very well, how it is to be living in an authoritarian regime. So I know about what I'm talking when I'm speaking about authoritarianism and about democracy. And I'm in favor of democracy. As a politician that has been serving the country also as Prime Minister, but before Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, because there are some countries where you don't need to be in the opposition to become Prime Minister. And also because I'm pro the Atlantic Alliance, as I've shown in many difficult decisions of my political life. I believe that's more important and more necessary than ever to have this alliance of democracies. Why? Because there are now very strong attacks to democracy, both within democracies and outside democracies, coming within our societies, but also coming from authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. I believe there is also a very important geopolitical dimension, and there are some implications of these choices. And that's why we have to be intelligent, and our strategy has to be sophisticated in the way we build, if you want to build, an alliance for democracies. And that's where I think the difficulties start. Mark Plattner said it very clearly. It's more controversial than could appear at first sight, even among Democrats, among Americans, among Europeans, inside the alliance. How can we do this? First of all, what is democracy? That's a very old question. And since some of you may also expect that, I prefer to refer to the European concept, as it is, by the way, in the Lisbon Treaty, the treaties that established the European Union. As a lawyer by training, I like to see the texts. And Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty defines the European Union on values, and the word is important, values. The Union, I'm reading, the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. So I will accept this as a good definition of democracy. For me, a democracy is a regime that includes these values. We can have other definitions, but that can be a good one. It's also interesting afterwards to look at Article 3 when it speaks about the relations with the wider world. So how do we translate these values not only when we speak about internal political regime, but in our relation with the outside world? And I read Article 3, number 5. In its relations with the wider world, the Union, European Union, shall uphold and promote its values and interests, and a word that appears here, and interests, and contribute to the protection of its citizens. It shall contribute to peace, security, the sustainable development of the earth, solidarity and moral respect among peoples, free and fair trade, eradication of poverty, and the protection of human rights, in particular the rights of the child, as well as to the strict observance and development of international law, including respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter. This is the credo of the European Union when it comes to democratic values, both internally and externally. That is why today we have some difficulties, because we listen sometimes to speak about illiberal democracy. That's a concept that circulates in some of our countries, and it was already very well mentioned by Karl Gershman that today there are some issues with democracy, and there is sometimes the decline of democracy. And so, for me, illiberal democracy is clearly an oxymoron, because a democracy cannot be illiberal. Indeed, the most important value of democracy is precisely liberty and freedom. If there is a specific, unique value to democracy, it's this one. Because there are others, to be frank, that other regimes can also claim, equality, whatever afterwards it means, and now it's implemented, it's a different issue. But there are regimes, like, by the way, the previous regime in Portugal, authoritarian right-wing regime, or the communist regimes, then speak about equality, they speak about justice, but usually they don't dare speak about freedom. Freedom, liberty. This is the core value of democracy. That's why it's impossible to have a democracy that is not for freedom or not for liberty. That's why it's impossible to have an illiberal democracy. Democracy is certainly the rule of majority. That's a basic principle, but with the respect of minority. By the way, it's very interesting the way Article 2 mentioned, because it says, including the respect of persons belonging to minorities. Not minorities as a group or as an organization, but as persons. Because at the core of the liberal concept of democracy, there is the human being. And human being is not an abstraction. It's not a party. It's not a state. It's not an ideology. It's not a religion. It's a person, a man, a woman, a child. And that's very important to note as well. Because at least for my conception of democracy, that is based in the, yes, I will say with it pride, Western tradition, the Western tradition that comes from classic Greece and Judeo-Christianism, what counts more is the human person, the human being, the irreplaceable dignity of each and every human being. This is important to note. And this is the Western tradition of democracy. Certainly, there are also in our Western tradition reference to communities, like countries, like nations, like other groups or even regions or organizations. But at the end of the day, what counts more is the human dignity of every human being. It's not irrelevant, these considerations, in the current ideological debate we have in our countries, including some of the more advanced democracies. Because we are seeing today a very dangerous situation where democracy and liberal democracy is attacked both from what traditionally we were calling the right or extreme right, and from what traditionally we call the left or the extreme left. That's the reality. We have populism, nativism, nationalism, xenophobia, and very often these ideas are more associated with the right, even if sometimes I believe it's difficult to make a distinction, where do they really come from? But we also have, including in some of the best universities in the world, cancel culture, where people cannot express their opinions, when there is a real limitation to the expression of people and to the fundamental principle of freedom of speech. So it comes also from the left, including some people that were proud to consider themselves progressive and are in fact limiting the space of freedom in our societies. That's why we have to stand for the basic principle of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, both against the right or the left or whatever. That's why it is important the center. And that's the point I want to make now, you believe, where I'm no longer in politics, as you know, but once you are in politics, you know also I'm now dealing with vaccines as chairman of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and politics is the kind of virus for which it was not yet discovered a vaccine. And in fact, I feel this attempt to make the point for the center. We need a strong center. The problem in our democracies is that very often the idea of center is associated with softness or weakness. The hard are the extremes. They are the strong authoritarian leaders, or even strong in convictions from the extreme right or from the extreme left. They take the initiative, they dominate the debate. And today, in many quarters, they dominate also the ideological debate. But what I would like to have is a political center right or center left. As you know, those of you who know me now, my party is in the center right. At least that's the traditional way it is put in the political spectrum. But in this case, I'm not speaking in a partisan way. I'm trying to make an analysis as honest as I can from an intellectual point of view. I believe we need a strong center left, a strong center right, a strong center. Some people that, because most of our citizens are moderate, they do not want to go to the extremes. But if they don't see their problem solved, their temptation will be precisely to go to the extremes. And if there is one lesson, there are many, but one lesson we can take from history is that the polarization of our systems, think of Republic of Weimar, but that's not the only one, the polarization of our political systems will bring war and can bring terrible suffering. This is why we need to fight against this extreme polarization by a reinforcement of the center, a center without the complex of being a right-wing minus or being a left-wing minus, but to be a center plus, to be for reforms of our countries, to have the courage to be firm in its convictions, including, of course, the conviction for democracy and for freedom. This is a battle, an intellectual battle that is not yet won, and that we see every day in the public space in some countries, including in Portugal, but we see in the United States, we see in the UK, where I now spend most of my time, in universities. It's a debate that, and in the rest of Europe and in the European Union, who is going to win that battle? It's also a battle of ideas, and that is why it's so important to discuss. Now I come to the real difficult point, where maybe we are going to have some disagreements. I believe we have to promote an alliance for democracies, but we have to be intelligent enough and sophisticated enough to avoid that alliance to be a reason to reinforce a kind of a Cold War between democracies and the rest. It will be misguided, and it will be dangerous to do so. I believe we democracies, we have an interest in keeping the world order open. We are for openness. This was the creation of those who built the world order we are living in, namely the United States of America and Western Europe after the Second World War. For some reason, the United Nations headquarters are in New York. And for some reason, the IMF and World Bank are in Washington. They are not in Beijing or Moscow, but they are also not in Europe, because Europe was devastated. And they are certainly not in Latin America or in Africa. And the vision of those leaders at that time, including, by the way, the most important European leaders that were Atlanticists, from Jean Monnet, that was living in the United States during the war, to Konrad Adenauer, to De Gasperi, to I mean, Robert Schuman, all of them were pro-American, pro-Western. They saw a direct link between creating the European community and containing the Soviet threat. That it was important. That was very important. And Jean Monnet said in one of his famous sentences, our states are too small for the Soviet Union of today, and they may be too small for the China of tomorrow. This is why we need the European Union also as part of that matter. But I believe that it's very important that we understand in the global order that there are some issues where we need to cooperate. Of course, I'm going to say the obvious, climate change, fight against climate change, but also today the fight against the pandemic that I follow now very directly because of this position I have now leading as chairman of the board Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines. These are issues that express common public goods where we need to cooperate. We may disagree, and we have the right and the duty to express our disagreement when we disagree, but I believe it is important to have an effort for a common global approach to those issues. I also believe that it will be a mistake to make immediately an equation or equivalence between democracies and a specific economic model or a specific defense model. In fact, democracies, they could and should continue to trade with everyone in the world. If democracies will only trade between themselves, they will not be so prosperous as they are today and as they were able to grow. So it's very important to have at the same time a position of principle that reiterates the sacred value of freedom and democracy, and at the same time the intelligence to avoid this alliance or this kind of, I would sometimes prefer to say complicity, this complicity that we need to have more than we certainly have today, and you are completely right. There are problems, including between the United States and Europe today, probably responsibilities on both sides, not only on one side. But the way to do it is, in fact, recognizing those problems, assuming as a position of principle the defense of our values, but at the same time avoiding the full contamination of the global order by what could become or not only a Cold War, but a war of a new type that I could tell you it will be completely different and much worse. Because the last wars we had, and were the most devastating wars in history during Second World War, are really minor compared to the capacity that today exists from a military point of view, and namely with the new developments of technology, starting with artificial intelligence. We are entering a completely new era today, where it's many multiples, the capacity to destroy compared to the past. So we need also to keep as our goal freedom and peace. Peace is part of the program of those who love freedom. And this is why I think it is important, and I will not have the time to go now in detail, to consider seriously the issue of NATO. NATO, as you know, it's an alliance for the North Atlantic. Its geography covers Europe and the North Americas. The question is, has NATO or not an interest in dealing with issues that are out of this area? My answer is yes, of course. Of course. Because today, security is indivisible. So if there are issues that are generated outside of our area, but they can represent a threat, a risk, or a challenge to our countries, including mine, Portugal, a founding member of NATO, in that case, I believe NATO has not only the right, but that has also the duty to consider it. I mean, just an example, I could tell you many more. Cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a risk, a challenge, and a threat originated outside, and we are running late. Please conclude. So, as you see, democratically, I'm fully transparent with you. I will conclude. But just to tell you that we have to consider how to do this. And I know the Secretary General of the United Nations, of course, is on that line as well, to consider this. But consider that does not mean now creating a global NATO. It means NATO being able to consider threats that are out of area. And finally, and I would have many other points, but it will be for other opportunity. Finally, I think the European in general, democracies, they have to do their homework. And they have not been doing it very successfully, let's put it frankly. Why we have this crisis in democracy? Basically because of two reasons. One, social economic, the perception of growing inequality, and the second, cultural identitarian, namely how to deal with migrants and foreigners and refugees. These are basically the drivers for, there are others, but these are basically drivers for this kind of dissatisfaction and frustration we feel today around democracy. Perception of growing inequality and threats to our identity. And then we have movements that exploit these sentiments and they can build very strong forces for populism or nationalism and sometimes aggressive political arguments. I believe at the same time that we need to do more on technology. The real superiority, even if the word superiority is a word that is problematic sometimes, for the future will be who leads in technological terms. That's where the solution is. And that's where we as democracies have to do more. The United States are doing a lot. But China, in some areas, namely the public sector, is already doing more, sometimes even than the United States. And Europe is not doing enough in some of these technologies that are in fact going to decide who will have a position of superiority in the world. Finally, of course, we need to keep an internationalist approach. I don't like the idea that democracies are closed on themselves. We have to be generous. That is why we have, for instance, in this issue of vaccination, when the Western world, or the more developed world, has more than 70% of people vaccinated, and Africa has less than 3%, we have a moral problem here. And we are feeding resentment. That was the reason why just last Friday I was speaking with President von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, and the week before with Mario Draghi, who is the current president or chair in office of G20. How can we avoid giving to the world the impression that some lives have more value than others? That we cannot accept. That is feeding resentment as well. So there is also a dimension of justice, global justice, when we speak about peace and when we speak about our values. The greatest honor I had in my life was not for me, was for the European Union, when on behalf of the European Union, I received the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in 2012. And in that speech of acceptance, I made the explicit link between peace and democracy. And I started quoting Spinoza when he said, peace is not just absence of war. Peace is a state of mind, spirit, of benevolence, of justice. I believe these are the values that were inspiring a great free thinker like Spinoza that should continue to inspire us if we want to live in a world of peace and freedom. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much for that set of very interesting remarks. I think there may be some differences of emphasis, if not of principle, between you and Carl Gershwin. Perhaps we can explore that later. But first, we'll hear from Wilhelm Hofmeister.
Thank you very much. I will try to make it short. I have 3 points. First, I would like to congratulate and to thank Professor João Espada for the efforts for organizing this wonderful meeting. I'm personally really impressed every year when I'm here, and I'm very grateful to Professor Espada for giving me the opportunity to share the panels with such distinguished speaker as today again. Unfortunately, this is my last time as a representative of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that I can join this meeting, and therefore, with much more heart, I would like to express my gratitude to Jean Espada and all those who organized this wonderful meeting. Second point, we are talking about alliances, and I think the comment of Karl Gershman has shown the differences between Europeans and Americans about perceptions or about evaluation of actual international context. Karl Gershman mentioned very clearly that we Europeans may have somewhat erroneous view on China, which is a topic which concerns a lot the United States, and we know that the United States is putting a lot of emphasis on this issue, but we are not sure that it is mainly democracy and human rights that moves the United States, or whether there are also other issues like business, international competition, and so on. But simply the fact that we do not really know how to evaluate the position of each other, this underlines the need to talk much more among us to get a common understanding. And this is one of the problems we have when we talk about new alliances, building new alliances. We have at the beginning actually this situation that we do not agree, as these leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt agreed when they had their prophetic agreement on the Atlantic Charter many decades ago. When we talk about building alliances, we should not keep only on these generalities. I think everybody agrees easily that it's necessary to have alliances on democracy, to agree, and so on and so forth. But I would like to go to the ground. Who are those who build these alliances? These are not states, people. It's people with blood and bones. And so I ask myself, who are the people actually who can build up alliances? Who are our leaders of the bigger states? Until very recently, we had a president of the United States who was not expressly committed to human rights and democracy. If I look to other big states like Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is he a leader to defend democracy? Going to Mexico, AMLO. Going to India, the biggest democracy on earth. Mr. Modi, is he committed really to the values of democracy? Not to talk about China, not to talk about Russia, not to talk about other countries, Widodo in Indonesia, and so on and so forth. And going to Europe, are we well, by one hand, we have some European partners who we doubt within our European community that they are committed with the values of democracy, and they are really committed to build alliances to defend democracy. But also those who are defending democracies, are we strong enough really at the moment and committed enough to do what we should do? It is absolutely correct in my point of view that people like Karl Gershman and others remind us in Europe that we have to do more. But if I look to my own country, I see that apparently sectors of our political society are not really committed to build. Everybody's talking nice about democracy, but if we go to the concrete issues, then we have a lack of people and resources and a lack of commitment. This brings me to my third point. Leaders alone cannot do it, because all the big leaders have something where they build upon, or where they are constructing upon, and these are political parties. And I think this is a very complicated issue. Therefore, I have written and published this book on political parties, Mark Plattner kindly mentioned at the beginning. How is the situation of political parties? Parties are probably the most essential institutions, the distinctive institutions like Huntington said decades ago. But how is the situation of our political parties? Do we trust political parties? I would like to ask you, Who trusts political parties? Please raise your hand. One. My next question, who is member of political parties? Please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, a little bit more. Relatively few people. You are the leaders of the future. And the political parties are the institutions which will build government, which we expect to construct democracies. But if we are not committed with the political parties, then it is very nice, I think, to talk about democracy. Of course, it's very frustrating, it's embarrassing, it's complicated, it's all to be engaged in political parties, to attend all these night meetings, and so on and so forth. But I think more and more people should do that. Therefore, I did write this book and recommend being member of political parties. We know that party systems are fragmented. We know that parties are polarized. We know that they are not able to deliver. If we talk about delivery, if we talk about social justice, the president also mentioned the capacity to come ahead with social and economic inclusion. Who can do this job, or who should do this job? These are the political parties. But unfortunately, we have at the moment a very complicated, weird situation of political parties all over the place, all over the world. And I think this is a serious problem, not only for the countries, because at the end of the day, also the political parties are those who must or should build the international alliances. We have party alliances which do not work, and we have other international alliances which also do not work because we have the lack of the capacity of people from political parties to be aware about the necessity, about the importance, about the relevance to construct all these international alliances. At the intellectual level, at the level of think tanks and academia, we are aware about the problems, but at the ground, we have a lack of people, like you, who can help the political parties to bring ahead these new efforts and to build really up upon or construct these new alliances. Karl Gershman tomorrow will talk about the National Endowment of Democracy. I could talk about the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and others. We have a lot of problems. We are trying to collaborate with political parties. And of course, it is not very beneficial because we always are disappointed at many points. But I think this is one of the very concrete actions we can do to foster international alliances. Therefore, I will stop here. I will end with a call to care more about political parties, because if we want to do something very concrete in favor of the construction of democratic alliances, we have to go to the ground and we have to do the job with the institutions which at the end of the day construct democracy. So you may feel invited, and I very much hope that you will be in the future political leaders who can really construct new alliances. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those remarks. Now, we have, I think, about 15 minutes or so left, since there was a interesting divergence that seemed to emerge on some questions between the two sides of the Atlantic. I'm not sure where Amikai sits in that thing, but let me first ask Carl if he wants to respond to the past two speakers, and we'll give Amikai a chance later too.
Well, you know, I was thinking, I wasn't advocating a new Cold War. I want to make that clear. I mean, the issue that people are saying there is a new Cold War. I mean, what I'm advocating is that these problems are global. I don't think we have any difference on that. And I was trying to, make the point that it's not enough for Europeans just to be concerned about the problems that are closer to home. And Russia is closer to home, and those are very, very serious problems. These exercises, military exercises that were just held by Russia and Belarus and some others in Belarus, I mean, very, very dangerous. But China is a bigger I mean, they're both big problems. And the other thing is they cooperate with each other. And this is an important aspect of international relations today. The authoritarians are cooperating, which means that the democracies must cooperate more. And, you know, we have to take an interest in the future of Taiwan. It matters to us. We have to take an interest in the problems that I mentioned. I mean, you know, I was using the point of COVID just to say that, you know, we live in a pretty small world, you know, and if this lab in Wuhan was the source of this problem, well, look what's happened. You know, that's pretty big. What I really want to also just emphasize is the point that Jose Manuel Barroso made about the need to strengthen the center. I don't think there's anything that's more important in our country. I can't say it enough how concerned I am, and I'm sure Mark shares this concern. I know that Bill Galston shares this concern about how deeply, deeply divided we are and how dangerous that is, not only for our country, but for freedom in the world. Sam Huntington used to say that if the United States is not in a position to exercise leadership and others fill in, it's going to be a much more violent and disorderly world, and democracy will be in worse shape and economic growth will be in worse shape. And we're possibly approaching that point. So, but I can't emphasize strongly enough how the importance of restoring a center in American politics, but I don't know how to do it. I mean, I think that's a big subject, but I don't have, this is such a deep problem. I don't have, you know, a meaningful program of action to recommend.
Amikai, did you want to say something before we turn to our European friends again?
I will, if I may. First of all, to our dear American friends, and this I think is a very important point to be internalized in Europe as well. Unless the United States gets its house in order and manages to restore some kind of centrist cohesion, it doesn't have to be complete agreement, of course. It could never be complete agreement, and disagreement is essential for democratic robustness and evolution. But if the United States is not able to restore some kind of cohesive center, then we truly are in profound trouble. You are the indispensable nation. You are the only force ultimately that will be able to maintain an open world order. And very much related to that, there's a lot of talk in Europe today about strategic autonomy and so on. And I do think it is important that European member states invest more in their capacity for self-defense, but also in R&D. It's not just about how much money you spend on defense, it's what you spend money on defense on. What do you spend the money on? And that's a very important conversation. But the reason why I emphasized the need for a reinvigorated transatlanticism is that without greater internal American cohesion, but also reinvigorated European American strategic alliances, with reaching out to other partners, there is absolutely no way that we will be able to properly manage relations with China. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not in a new Cold War, but we are, for all intents and purposes, in a new global reality of bipolarity. In some respects, a much more dangerous, interconnected bipolarity than the one that we had during the Cold War. The liberal international order that we have enjoyed for the last 3 or 4 decades is now splitting into 2 global spheres of influence. still a Western broadly open and liberal order, which is currently in some degree of turmoil and relative military and technological decline, and an increasingly aggressive, high-tech, capitalist authoritarian or high-tech authoritarian Chinese-dominated international order. And China will do what great powers have always done throughout human history, which is to try to shape the international environment, first and foremost their regional environment, but in the 21st century also the global environment. The Chinese will try to shape the international environment in line with the values and principles of the Chinese Communist Party. They are already doing it, and they will continue to do it. And the only way that that could be curtailed and controlled is through a renaissance of an alliance of democracies. The only way that we will ultimately prevent a catastrophic military conflict with China is by reinvigorating a rules-based international order, not in an aggressive way, not in a necessarily antagonistic way, but in a way that sends a very clear signal to China and its authoritarian allies that we are not going to allow a creeping process of annexation and aggression. I'm afraid we've missed that opportunity with regards to Hong Kong, and the next big case is Taiwan. And unless we stand in defense of Taiwan, China will continue its campaign of armament and aggression, and it will be extremely dangerous for all of us, not least in the European Union.
And let's have brief concluding remarks from our two European colleagues. First, Dr. Barroso, and then Dr. Hofmeister.
I have not so much things to add to what I already said. I believe when it comes to geopolitics, we should not be naive. In geopolitics, it's not just democracies that count. NATO was essential to preserve the democracies, but it was not made by democracies only. My country was a founder member of NATO, and it was not a democracy. Greece and Turkey, they were military regimes, and they were members of NATO. So the idea to make the equation, we put all the democracies here and they're going to fight the rest of the world, I'm sorry to say it's very naive. Very naive. Because sometimes we need to work with regimes that are not democracies. By the way, since I may, in '73, probably you have heard about Yom Kippur, when Israel was under attack. And most partners of the United States in Europe, almost all democracies, rejected the request made by then President Nixon to help the United States transport weapons and ammunition to Israel. Where were they coming through? Through the Portuguese base of Lajes in Açores. It was Portugal, in fact. It was the Netherlands also supported, but apparently the Prime Minister did not even consult his government because democracies were not ready to defend Israel. And at that moment, an authoritarian regime, Portugal, certainly with some pressure maybe, but that's an example, but I could multiply the examples of democracies working with non-democracies. When we tried to contain the Soviet Union, and by the way, NATO has been a great success, we have worked with non-democracies. So let's not be cynical or hypocritical. Let's be honest intellectually. We are, after all, we are in an academic setting here, aren't we? So this is why it's very important to understand this point. I'm absolutely in favor and I've been doing it, I think, for my life already for some time, of uniting our democracies, of promoting the values and principles of democracy, both within, because they are challenged within, but also globally. But I would like to make a warning against the risk of splitting the global community when for some goals we need to work together. And I mentioned some goals. One is the protection of our planet. Another thing is to fight against pandemics. Another thing is to keep trade basically open. Another thing is to have financial stability. There are global public goods. And if we need to, on some issues, if we need to speak with China, we should speak with China. And we should speak open with China. But if we do not agree with China on fundamental issues of human rights, we should, as a very important position of principle, state it and make, of course, what we believe it's appropriate at that time, of course, judging all the consequences of our actions, as anyone will do from a realpolitik point of view. So this is my point, because I think if not, we may be going for a situation where, with the best of intentions, we create more problems than the solutions we find.
Thank you for those comments, and to conclude, let me turn to Dr. Hoffman.
Well, I would say, however, we should not forget that all these common goods can only be defended and promoted within free societies. And this is a point why we should defend and promote democracy. It's not only about democracy, it's also about all the other things, because we are convinced that democracy is the best environment and general condition for resolving all the other issues related to common goods, to social benefits, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, as Mark Plattner and other authors indicate since roughly about 15 years, the attacks are coming closer to us. That is the problem. The attacks are coming closer to us in Europe. I sometimes mention a very simple observation. Some 10 years ago, we were all very hopeful about Arab Spring. After the Muslim Brotherhood gaining the government in Egypt, and after the military came back to Egypt, we are very calm. We don't talk much about democracy, neither in Egypt nor in other Arab states anymore. And it's not only the academic community or the normal democracy defenders, but also our media. Nobody talks in our days about these issues. And so we are getting used, and we are getting more and more attacked. We are getting more and more attacked by China, by Russia. They try to intervene in our elections, and so on and so forth. So I'm not so optimistic at all. And after Afghanistan, I think we, the democracy promoters, we will have a tough time in the future, because will become much more difficult to work in this area. In many countries, the room to work for democracy had been closed over the last decades already in many countries. Became more and more difficult for civil society organizations, not to talk about political parties, but also for media. We know that media, liberty of expression, liberty of free media, and so have been restricted. So we are really in a very complicated situation, and therefore I think it's important to be aware that we have to work together to defend our democracies. Taiwan, by the way, can be, and this is my last word, I think can be a very interesting case. I have been only very few times in Taiwan, but I'm convinced that this is the most democratic country in Asia, in a certain ways, because I was really impressed by many aspects of the Taiwanese society. Of course, they have a lot of problems, as everything. So if you have the opportunity, travel to Taiwan, try to get in touch with Taiwanese colleagues, with intellectuals. I think this can also contribute in a very small form to maintain the spirit of democracy in this country, which is really exposed to serious danger, and maybe so everybody can do a small contribution to promote and disseminate democracy in the globe. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you and to all the members of our panel for what I think was a very lively and provocative discussion. And thank you all for listening.